Birch Browsings, Part 2. After looking in vain for the line of marked trees, we moved off to the left in a doubtful, hesitating manner, keeping on the highest ground and blazing the trees as we went. We were afraid to go downhill, lest we should descend too soon. Our vantage ground was high ground. A thick fog coming on, we were more bewildered than ever. Still we pressed forward, climbing up ledges and wading through ferns for about 2 hours, when we paused by a spring that issued from beneath an immense wall of rock that belted the highest part of the mountain. There was quite a broad plateau here, and the birch wood was very dense and the trees of unusual size. After resting and exchanging opinions, we all concluded that it was best not to continue our search encumbered as we were, but we were not willing to abandon it altogether, and I proposed to my companions to leave them beside the spring with our traps, while I made one thorough and final effort to find the lake. If I succeeded and desired them to come forward, I was to fire my gun 3 times. If I failed and wished to return, I would fire twice, they of course responding. So filling my canteen from the spring, I set out again, taking the spring run for my guide. Before I had followed it 200 yards, it sank into the ground at my feet. I had half a mind to be superstitious and to believe that we were under a spell, since our guides played us such tricks. However, I determined to put the matter to a further test and struck out boldly to the left. This seemed to be the key word: to the left, to the left. The fog had now lifted, so that I could form a better idea of the lay of the land. Twice I looked down the steep sides of the mountain, sorely attempting to risk a plunge. Still I hesitated and kept along the brink. As I stood on a rock deliberating, I heard a crackling of the brush, like the tread of some large game on the plateau below me. Suspecting the truth of the case, I moved stealthily down and found a herd of young cattle leisurely browsing. We had several times crossed their trail and had seen that morning a level, grassy place on the top of the mountain where they had passed the night. Instead of being frightened, as I had expected, they seemed greatly delighted and gathered around me as if to inquire the tidings from the outer world, perhaps the quotations of the cattle market. They came up to me and eagerly licked my hand, clothes, and gun. Salt was what they were after, and they were ready to swallow anything that contained the smallest percentage of it. They were mostly yearlings and as sleek as moles. They had a very gamey look. We were afterwards told that in the spring the farmers round about turn into these woods their young cattle, which do not come out again till fall. They are then in good condition, not fat like grass-fed cattle, but trim and supple like deer. Once a month the owner hunts them up and salts them. They have their beats and seldom wander beyond well-defined limits. It was interesting to see them feed. They browsed on the low limbs and bushes and on the various plants, munching at everything without any apparent discrimination. They attempted to follow me, but I escaped them by clambering down some steep rocks. I now found myself gradually edging down the side of the mountain, keeping around it in a spiral manner and scanning the woods and the shape of the ground for such encouraging hint or sign. Finally the woods became more open and the descent less rapid. The trees were remarkably straight and uniform in size. Black birches, the first I had ever seen, were very numerous. I felt encouraged. Listening attentively, I caught from a breeze just lifting the drooping leaves a sound that I willingly believe was made by a bullfrog. On this hint I tore down through the woods at my highest speed. Then I paused and listened again. This time there was no mistaking it. It was the sound of frogs. Much elated, I rushed on. By and by I could hear them as I ran. "Pathung, pathung," croaked the old ones. "Pug, pug," shrilly joined in the smaller fry. Then I caught through the lower trees a gleam of blue, which I first thought was distant sky. A second look and I knew it to be water, and in a moment more I stepped from the woods and stood upon the shore of the lake. I exulted silently. There it was at last, sparkling in the morning sun and as beautiful as a dream. It was so good to come upon such open space and such bright hues after wandering in the dim, dense woods. The eye is as delighted as an escaped bird and darts gleefully from point to point. The lake was a long oval, scarcely more than a mile in circumference, with evenly wooded shores which rose gradually on all sides. After contemplating the scene for a moment, I stepped back into the woods and, loading my gun as heavily as I dared, discharged it 3 times. The reports seemed to fill all the mountains with sound. The frogs quickly hushed, and I listened for the response, but no response came. Then I tried again and again, but without evoking an answer. One of my companions, however, who had climbed to the top of the high rocks in the rear of the spring, thought he heard faintly one report. It seemed an immense distance below him and far around under the mountain. I knew I had come a long way, and hardly expecting to be able to communicate with my companions in the manner agreed upon, I therefore started back, choosing my course without any reference to the circuitous route by which I had come, and loading heavily and firing at intervals. I must have aroused many long dormant echoes from a Rip Van Winkle sleep. As my powder got low, I fired and hollowed alternately, till I came near splitting both my throat and gun. Finally, after I had begun to have a very ugly feeling of alarm and disappointment, and to cast about vaguely for some course to pursue in an emergency that seemed near at hand, namely the loss of my companions now I had found the lake. A favoring breeze brought me the last echo of response. I rejoined with spirit, and hastened with all speed in the direction whence the sound had come, but after repeated trials failed to elicit another answering sound. This filled me with an apprehension again. I feared that my friends had been misled by the reverberations, and I pictured them to myself hastening the opposite direction, paying little attention to my course, but paying dearly for my carelessness afterward. I rushed forward to undeceive them, but they had not been deceived, and in a few moments an answering shout revealed them near at hand. I heard their tramp, the bush parted, and we 3 met again. I answered to their eager inquiries. I assured them that I had seen the lake, that it was at the foot of the mountain, and that we could not miss it if we kept straight down from where we then were. My clothes were soaked in perspiration, but I shouldered my knapsack with alacrity, and we began the descent. I noticed that the woods were much thicker, and had quite a different look from those I had passed through, but thought nothing of it, as I expected to strike the lake near its head, whereas I had before come out at its foot. We had not gone far when we crossed a line of marked trees, which my companions were disposed to follow. It intersected our course nearly at right angles, and kept along and up the side of the mountain. My impression was that it led up from the lake, and that by keeping our course we should reach the lake sooner than if we had followed this line. About halfway down the mountain we could see through the interstices the opposite slope. I encouraged my comrades by telling them that the lake was between us and that, and not more than a half-mile distant. We soon reached the bottom, where we found a small stream and quite an extensive alder swamp, evidently the ancient bed of a lake. I explained to my half-vexed and half-incredulous companions that we were probably above the lake, and that this stream must lead to it. "Follow it," they said. "We will wait here till we hear from you." So I went on, more than ever disposed to believe that we were under a spell, and that the lake had slipped from my grasp after all. Seeing no favorable sign, I went forward. I laid down my accoutrements and climbed a decayed beech that leaned out over the swamp, and promised a good view from the top. As I stretched myself up to look from the highest attainable branch, there was suddenly a loud crack at the root. With a celerity that would at least have done credit to a bear, I regained the ground, having caught but a momentary glimpse of the country, but enough to convince me no lake was near. Leaving all encumbrances here but my gun, I still pressed on, loath to be thus baffled. After floundering through another alder swamp for nearly half a mile, I flattered myself that I was close to the lake. I caught sight of a low spur of the mountain sweeping around the half-extended arm, and I fondly imagined that with that within its grasp was the object of my search, but I found only one more alder swamp. After this region was cleared, the creek began to descend the mountain very rapidly. Its banks became high and narrow, and it went whirling away with a sound that seemed to my ears like a burst of ironical laughter. I turned back with a feeling of mingled disgust, shame, and vexation. In fact, I was almost sick, and when I reached my companions after an absence of nearly 2 hours, hungry, fatigued, and disheartened, I would have sold my interest in Thomas's Lake at a very low figure. For the first time I heartily wished myself well out of the woods. Thomas might keep his lake, and the enchanters guard his possession. I doubted if he had ever found it the second time, or if anyone else ever had. My companions, who were quite fresh, and who had not felt the strain of baffled purpose as I had, assumed a more encouraging tone. After I had rested a while and partaken sparingly of the bread and whiskey, in which such an emergency is a great improvement on bread and water, I agreed to their proposition that we should make another attempt. As if to reassure us, a robin sounded his cheery call nearby, and the winter wren, the first I had ever heard in these woods, set his music box going, which fairly ran over with thin, gushing, lyrical sounds. There can be no doubt but that this bird is one of our finest songsters. If it would only thrive and sing well when caged, like the canary, how far it would surpass that bird. It has all the vivacity and versatility of the canary without any of its shrillness. Its song is indeed a little cascade of melody. We again retraced our steps, rolling the stone as it were back up the mountain, determined to commit ourselves to the line of marked trees. These were finally reached, and after exploring the country to the right, saw that the beginning of the bearing to the left was still the order. The trail led up over a gentle rise of ground, and in less than 20 minutes we were in the woods. I had passed through when I found the lake. The error I had made was then plain. We had come off the mountain a few paces too far to the right, and so had passed down on the wrong side of the ridge into what we afterwards learned was the valley of Alder Creek. We now made good time, and before many minutes I again saw the mimic sky glance through the trees. As we approached the lake, a solitary woodchuck, the first wild animal we had seen since entering the woods, sat crouched upon the root of a tree a few feet from the water, apparently completely nonplussed by the unexpected appearance of danger on the land side. All retreat was cut off, and he looked his fate in the face without flinching. I slaughtered him just as a savage would have done, and from the same motive. I wanted his carcass to eat. The mid-afternoon sun was now shining upon the lake, and a low, steady breeze drove the little waves rocking to the shore. A herd of cattle was browsing on the other side, and the bell of the leader sounded across the water. In these solitudes its clang was wild and musical. To try the trout was the first thing in order. On a rude raft of log which we found moored at the shore, and which with the two aboard shipped about a foot of water, we floated out and wet our first fly in Thomas's Lake, but the trout refused to jump, and to be frank, not more than 12 were caught during our stay. Only a week previous, a party of 3 had taken in a few hours all the fish they could carry out of the woods, and had nearly surfeited the neighbors with trout. But from some cause they now refused to rise or to touch any kind of bait. So we fell to catching the sunfish, which were small but very abundant. The nests were all along the shore. A space about the size of a breakfast plate was cleared of sediment and decayed vegetable matter, revealing the pebbly bottom, fresh and bright, with 1 or 2 fish suspended over the center of it, keeping watch and ward. If an intruder approached, they would dart at him spitefully. These fish have the air of bantam cocks, and with their sharp prickly fins and spines and scaly sides must be ugly customers in a hand-to-hand encounter with other finny warriors. To a hungry man they look about as unpromising as hemlock slivers, so thorny and thin are they, yet there is sweet meat in them, as we found that day. Much refreshed, I set out with the sun low in the west to explore the outlet of the lake and try for trout there, while my companions made further trials in the lake itself. The outlet, as is usual in bodies of water of this kind, was very gentle and private. The stream, 6 or 8 feet wide, followed silently and evenly for a distance of 3 or 4 rods, when it suddenly, as if conscious of its freedom, took a leap down some rocks. Thence, as far as I followed it, the descent was very rapid through a continuous succession of brief falls like so many steps down the mountain. Its appearance promised more trout than I found, though I returned to camp with a very respectable string. Toward sunset I went around to explore the inlet and found that, as usual, the stream would wound leisurely through marshy ground. The water being much colder than in the outlet, the trout were more plentiful. As I was picking my way over the miry ground and through the rank growths, a rough grouse hopped up on a fallen branch a few paces before me, and jerking his tail threatened to take flight. But as I was at the moment gunless and remained stationary, he presently jumped down and walked away. A seeker of birds and ever on the alert for some new acquaintance, my attention was arrested on first entering the swamp by a bright, lively song or warble that issued from the branches overhead, and that was entirely new to me, though there was something in the tone that told me the bird was related to the wood wagtail and to the water wagtail or thrush. The strain was emphatic and quite loud, like the canary's, but very brief. The bird kept itself well secreted in its upper branches of the trees, and for a long time eluded my eye. I passed to and fro several times, and it seemed to break out afresh as I approached a certain little bend in the creek, and to cease after I had got beyond it. No doubt its nest was somewhere near in the vicinity. After some delay the bird was sighted and brought down. It proved to be a small or northern water thrush, called also the New York water thrush, a new bird to me. In size it was noticeably smaller than the large or Louisiana water thrush as described by Audubon, but in other respects its general appearance was the same. It was a great treat to me, and again I felt myself in luck. The bird was unknown to the older ornithologists, and it is but poorly described by the new. It builds a mossy nest on the ground or under the edge of a decayed log. A correspondent writes me that he has found it breeding on the mountains in Pennsylvania. The large-billed water thrush is much the superior songster, but the present species has a very bright and cheerful strain. The specimen I saw, contrary to the habits of the family, kept in the tree-tops like a warbler and seemed to be engaged in catching insects. The birds were unusually plentiful and noisy about the head of this lake. Robins, blue jays, and woodpeckers greeted me with their familiar notes. The blue jays found an owl or some wild animal a short distance above me, and, as is their custom on such occasions, proclaimed it at the top of their voices and kept on till the darkness began to gather in the woods. I also heard, as I had at 2 or 3 other points in the course of the day, the peculiar resonant hammering of some species of woodpecker upon the hard, dry limbs. It was unlike any sound of the kind I had ever heard, and repeated at intervals through the silent wood was a very marked and characteristic feature. Its peculiarity was at the ordered succession of the raps which gave it the character of a premeditated performance. There were first 3 strokes following each other rapidly, then 2 much louder ones with longer intervals between them. I heard the drumming here, and the next day at sunset at Furlough Lake, the source of Dry Brook, and in no instance was the order varied. There was a melody in it, such as a woodpecker knows how to evoke from a smooth, dry branch. It suggested something quite as pleasing as the liveliest bird song, and was, if anything, more woodsy and wild. As the yellow-bellied woodpecker was the most abundant species in this wood, I attribute it to him. It is the one sound that still links itself with those scenes in my mind. At sunset the grouse began to drum in all parts of the woods about the lake. I could hear 5 at one time, thump, 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 thrrr. It was a homely welcome sound. As I returned to camp at twilight along the shore of the lake, the frogs also were in full chorus. The older ones ripped out their responses to each other with terrific force and volume. I know of no other animal capable of giving forth so much sound in proportion to its size as a frog. Some of these seemed to bellow as loud as a 2-year-old bull. They were of immense size and very abundant. No frog-eater had ever been there. Near the shore we felled a tree which reached far out in the lake. Upon the trunk and branches the frogs soon collected in large numbers and gamboled and splashed about the half-submerged top like a parcel of schoolboys, making nearby as much noise. After dark I was frying the fish. A pan full of the largest trout was accidentally capsized in the fire. With rueful countenances we contemplate the irreparable loss our commissariat had sustained by this mishap, but remembering there was virtue in ashes, we poked the half-consumed fish from the bed of coals and ate them, and they were good. We lodged that night on a brush heap and slept soundly. The green, yielding beech twigs covered with a buffalo robe were equal to a hair mattress. The heat and smoke from a large fire kindled in the afternoon had banished every no-see-um from the locality, and in the morning the sun was above the mountain before we awoke. I immediately started again for the inlet and went far up the stream toward its source. A fair string of trout for breakfast was my reward. The cattle with the bell were at the head of the valley where they passed the night. Most of them were 2-year-old steers. They came up to me and begged for salt and scared the fish by their importunities. We finished our bread that morning and ate every fish we could catch, and at about 10 o'clock prepared to leave the lake. The weather had been admirable, and the lake is a gem, and I would gladly have spent a week in the neighborhood, but the question of supplies was a serious one and would brook no delay. When we reached on our return the point where we had crossed the line of marked trees the day before, the question arose whether we should still trust ourselves to this line or follow our own trail back to the spring and the battlement of rocks on the top of the mountain, and thence to the rock where the guide had left us. We decided in favor of the former course. After a march of 3/4 of an hour, the blazed trees ceased, and we concluded we were near the point at which we had parted with our guide. So we built a fire, laid down our loads, and cast about on all sides for some clue as to our exact locality. Nearly an hour was consumed in this manner, and without any result. I came upon a brood of young grouse which diverted me for a moment. The old one blustered about at a furious rate, trying to draw all attention to herself, while the young ones, which were unable to fly, hid themselves. She whined like a dog in great distress, and dragged herself along apparently with the greatest difficulty. As I pursued her, she ran very nimbly, and presently flew a few yards. Then, as I went on, she flew farther and farther each time, till at last she got up and went humming through the woods as if she had no interest in them. I went back and caught one of the young, which had simply squatted close to the ground. I then put it in my coat sleeve, when it ran and nestled in my armpit. When we met at the sign of the smoke, opinions differed as to the most feasible course. There was no doubt but that we could get out of the woods, but we wished to get out speedily and as nearly as possible to the point where we had entered. Half ashamed of our timidity and indecision, we finally tramped away back where we had crossed the line of blazed trees, followed our old trail to the spring on the top of the range, and after much searching and scouring to the right and left, found ourselves at the very place we had left 2 hours before. Another deliberation and a divided council. But something must be done. It was then mid-afternoon, and the prospect of spending another night on the mountain without food or drink was not pleasant. So we moved down the ridge. Here another line of marked trees was found, the course of which formed an obtuse angle with the one we had followed. It kept on the top of the ridge for perhaps a mile when it disappeared, and we were as much adrift as ever. Then one of the party swore an oath and said he was going out of the woods, hit or miss, and wheeling to the right instantly plunged over the brink of the mountain. The rest followed, but would fain have paused and ciphered away at their own uncertainties to see if a certainty could not be arrived at as to where we would come out. But our bold leader was solving the problems in the right way. Down and still down we went, as if we were to bring up in the bowels of the earth. It was by far the steepest descent we had made, and we felt a grim satisfaction in knowing we could not retrace our steps this time, be the issue what it might. As we paused on the brink of a ledge of rocks, we chanced to see through the trees distant cleared land. A house or barn also was dimly descried. This was encouraging, but we could not make out whether it was on Beaverkill or Millbrook or Drybrook, and did not long stop to consider where it was. We at last brought up at the bottom of a deep gorge through which flowed a rapid creek that literally swarmed with trout. But we were in no mood to catch them, and pushed on along the channel of the stream, sometimes leaping from rock to rock, and sometimes splashing heedlessly through the water, and speculating the while as to where we should probably come out. On the Beaverkill, my companions thought, but from the position of the sun, I set on the Millbrook, about 6 miles below our team, for I remembered having seen in coming up this stream a deep wild valley that led up into the mountains, like this one. Soon the banks of the stream became lower, and we moved into the woods. Here we entered upon an obscure wood road, which presently conducted us into the midst of a vast hemlock forest. The land had a gentle slope, and we wondered by the lumbermen and barkmen who prowl these woods had left this fine track untouched. Beyond this, the forest was mostly birch and maple. We were now close to settlement and began to hear human sounds. 1 rod more and we were out of the woods. It took us a moment to comprehend the scene. Things looked very strange at first, but quickly they began to change and to put on familiar features. Some magic scene shifting seemed to take place before my eyes, till instead of the unknown settlement which I had at first seemed to look upon, there stood the farmhouse at which we had stopped 2 days before, and at the same moment we heard the stamping of our team in the barn. We sat down and laughed heartily over our good luck. Our desperate venture had resulted better than we had dared to hope, and had shamed our wisest plans. At the house, our arrival had been anticipated about this time, and dinner was being put upon the table. It was then 5 o'clock, so that we had been in the woods just 48 hours, but if time is only phenomenal, as the philosophers say, and life only in feeling, as the poets aver, we were some months, if not years, older at that moment than we had been 2 days before, yet younger too. Though this be a paradox, for the birches had infused into us some of their own suppleness and strength. 1869, Birch Browsings by John Burroughs.